So let's go over what you find in Lesson 1 of the only grant writing book you'll ever need, which is called Who Am I and What in the World Do I Want to Do? And also Lesson 2 of the only grant writing book you'll ever need, which is called What is a Grant and Where Do I Get One? And there's a lot of information in this second lesson. So, Lesson 1, Who am I and what in the world do I want to do? There are 3 broad categories of organizations that will seek grants. There are grassroots organizations, which tend to be small, very local, not as formally organized as other organizations. There are social service agencies, which tend to be categorized in 3 ways. One is they could be nonprofit organizations. They have, from the IRS, 501c3 status, which we'll talk about shortly. They could be local government agencies. They could be for-profit businesses. They could also be advocacy groups, local, regional, citywide, national, or international. And these tend to be more single topic oriented, and they tend to be more political and aimed in particular kinds of political directions, therefore not eligible to be nonprofit. And finally, individuals can often get grants, but we're not really focused on those. But if you're an author, if you're a filmmaker, if you're a scholar, there are grant programs available to support the work that you do. So, social service providers. There could be community-based organizations that serve a particular geographic or demographic community. So you might have, for example, the Spartanburg chapter of Habitat for Humanity. They could be cultural institutions like libraries, museums, archives, or theaters. Here in Spartanburg we have the Chapman Cultural Center. That's an example of a cultural institution. They could be universities and hospitals. So obviously USC Upstate is an organization that gets a great many grants. We have the Greenville Health System locally and the Mary Black Health System as well. Now, specifically, when we talk about nonprofit organizations, we usually talk about an organization that has this particular IRS status, 501c3. That refers to a specific section of the Internal Revenue Service Code that authorizes this type of organization. The advantage of having this is that you have tax-exempt status as an organization. You don't have to pay taxes, and anybody who donates to you will find their donations tax deductible at the end of the year. It does require paperwork that other kinds of organizations don't have to submit, but you've always got paperwork of one kind or another. So, those are the different kinds of organizations. Now you think about, all right, so if there's a particular grant, who's going to get it? The important thing to remember with different grants is that each of them has different requirements. So some grants will only go to organizations that have 501c3 status. Some grants will only go to local or state agencies. Some grants only go to a local education agency. Some grants only go to programs that affect children. The grant maker gets to decide where they want their grants to go, and you should pay attention to that before you think about applying so that you know whether or not your organization is eligible and whether or not the project that you want to pursue is eligible. You want to review all of the grant deadlines. When you find a grant program, it will typically have a set of requirements. It will give you the due date for submitting. It will give you the requirements of what you need to submit in order to apply for the grant. And there could be greater or lesser amounts of information that they require. It's going to take you time to get all that together and to get it submitted on time. So, don't do the work of applying for a grant or starting the work of applying for a grant without first making sure that your project and your organization are eligible for that particular grant. The good news is the text that you create, the language that you write up for one particular grant, you can reuse with other grants. You're going to be describing your organization in the same way from one grant to the other. Often you are describing the project that you're funding in the same way from one grant application to another. So that's good. But you always want to review the grant guidelines before you get started. So, if you have any questions, be sure to jump into the forums on Blackboard to share the questions there and to participate in the discussion there. Now, let's move on to Lesson 2. Lesson 2 is about what a grant is. Like, let's think about how do we define what a grant is and where to get one. So what is a grant? A grant is an award of money, obviously. I think most people know that. But what a lot of times people don't understand is the grants are given for very specific purposes. A foundation or an organization that has money wants to enable certain kinds of change in the world. And so they will say in their guidelines, this is what we want this money to go towards. It might go towards providing more affordable, decent housing in a community. It might go towards increasing educational opportunities for children in K through 12 education. It might go towards providing shelter and counseling for people who are victims of domestic violence. These are all grants that locally different organizations have gotten from agencies with money to give. They're usually very specific expectations in that they want you to do specific things with their money. They may outlaw spending money on certain kinds of things. Sometimes they'll say we don't want this money going towards staff, like we don't want it to pay salary. Sometimes they'll say this money must be used within these particular parameters of what you spend it on. Like you can't spend it on equipment. You know, you can only spend it on, for example, counseling to members of a community. There are going to be different kinds of expectations and requirements about how you use that money. So, you need to think first of all, when you are an organization that has projects that you want to complete, think about whether or not you need a grant. What is your organization's mission? It's very rare for an individual in a community to decide, I'm going to apply for a grant because I want to see some changes here. It's usually some kind of local organization of the kinds that we talked about in Lesson 1. So you think about what is the mission of this particular organization. For example, I use Habitat for Humanity a lot simply because I'm pretty familiar with them. Their mission is to provide decent, affordable housing for low-income families in need. That's the mission. So from that, they then think about, well, what problem are we trying to solve here in Spartanburg? The problem is, around the world, but also if you're the local affiliate of Habitat, the problem here locally is there is not enough decent and affordable housing for low-income families. There are far too many homes that are substandard, that are unsafe, or that are not well maintained. And so that's the problem. They have evidence of this problem, and they're able to point to specific neighborhoods where things could be better. What methods are you going to use to solve the problem? How do you go about fixing what you see as the problem in your community? What Habitat does is build houses with a lot of volunteer labor, a lot of donated materials, but they also have to they have to pay some professionals to do some of the work because you can't just have volunteers who aren't necessarily licensed putting in your electrical and your plumbing. So they need a certain amount of money per house to make things happen. But what they do is build houses. They build decent, affordable houses for the individuals that they serve. And they then have the individuals buy those houses with an interest-free mortgage. It saves a great deal of money, and it really helps transform neighborhoods. That's obviously I'm in favor of the kind of work that Habitat does, but I'm just trying to use them as an example of thinking about whether or not you need a grant. And so once you figure out, well, this is what we want to do, we want to build houses, we want to build a house, and we want to make it available in no interest mortgage for a family. All right, well, how much money is it going to take to make that happen? So Habitat might say, and I don't know that this number is accurate, but $60,000 per house. All right, so there you've decided we have a mission, we know the problem we're trying to solve, we have a way of how we're going to solve that problem, and we have an idea of how much money we need. So what you want to do is focus on the mission. You don't want to start with the idea of, well, I've got an organization and we need money. So what can we do to get some money? What you want to do is focus on the mission. So if Habitat were to say something like, oh, there's a grant available for building playgrounds for children because children are not getting enough activity in certain neighborhoods. Neighborhoods that tend to be impoverished don't have nice playgrounds for children. And so what we're going to do, here's this grant, it offers up to $100,000. We really need that money, so we're going to apply for that. That doesn't make sense because that's not their mission. Their mission is not healthy children. I'm sure they're not opposed to healthy children, but that's not the point of what they're trying to do. The point of what they're trying to do is provide decent, affordable housing to solve this problem. It's going to take time and effort to manage grants. You don't want to spend most of your time looking for grants and then making your mission whatever it is the grants have available. You start with the mission. These are the things that we think are important, that we want to do. Then you look for the grant. You don't find a grant and then try to come up with a project that's going to fulfill that grant. And you want to think about things specifically in this order. What's your organization's mission? What are you trying to solve? What methods are you going to use to solve that problem? How much money do you need? And then what kind of grants are out there that will help you do number 3 and 2? So remember, all fundraising should flow from and support your organization's mission. And that's from the Only Grant Writing Book You'll Ever Need, Lesson 2. It's one thing to do everything in your power to find grants that support your programs, but it's something else entirely to pursue grants that distract you from your core mission. Don't find a grant that has a lot of money but that isn't related to what you do, but then decide, well, we're going to change what we do because we want that money. All right, so who has the money? Well, there are foundations like the Mary Black Foundation here in Spartanburg. There are businesses, sometimes like Home Depot will offer grants for projects. There are federal grants that come from places like the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Department of Education, and there are state and city government grants. Those are among the most common sources of grants that are out there. When you think about foundations, they fall into a variety of different categories. It could be a family foundation, it could be an independent private foundation. Federated funds are places like the United Way. There could be corporate foundations that are separate from businesses that a corporate has actually set up its own foundation for things. There could be community foundations like there is one for Spartanburg County. Sometimes financial institutions have their own foundations where they offer money for certain kinds of projects. There are lots of different possibilities that are out there. So if you want to approach a foundation and you're thinking about, well, you know what your mission is, you know what community problem you're trying to address, and you know how you want to go about doing it. So how do you approach a foundation once you've found it? The first thing that you want to do is as much research as you can before you contact them. So visit their website, see what kind of information you can find out on their website. What are the different grant programs they have? What are the different requirements that they have? What kinds of projects have they funded in the past? Find or ask for their annual report. Foundations are usually pretty open, not always, but usually pretty open about what they've been up to. So do they have a recent annual report? It might be on their website, or you might have to contact them and ask for it. Look for an application form for a particular grant. Sometimes you have what's called a rolling deadline, where over the course of the year, that they'll submit, they'll take applications at any point in time during the year. In my experience, that's rare. The more common thing is that they'll say, All right, applications for this particular grant are due on June 30th, and we will let people know our decisions by July 31st, something like that. So what you want to do is find the application form to see what they require and to see when the deadline is. You also want to find or ask for application guidelines. What kind of information do they want? Do they want to have something like a resume from all the people who are participating in the project that you want to complete? Do they want to have a mock-up of, if you're going to be building buildings like Spartanburg Habitat, do they want a blueprint of what the building looks like? If you're going to be offering classes on something to people in different communities, do they want a syllabus of what you're going to do? Like, just see what kinds of guidelines they want. Do they, they're probably going to, if they require you to be a nonprofit organization, they probably want proof of nonprofit status. See if you can find examples of funded projects. Have they done things in the past? Have they given money to projects in the past that look like your project? And then look up their 990s on guidestar.org. So a 990 is a form that the IRS began requiring relatively recently, like within the last 15 or 20 years. I think it's more like the last 15 years. And what the 990 does is, for a foundation, it tells you everything about their financials, like where the money came from and where the money went, and that gives you a good idea of what kind of projects and what kind of initiatives they've been involved in. So do this research as much as you can, as deeply as you can first. So, how do you find grant opportunities? There is a lot of information available online. A lot of it's free, some of it's not free. And these are the things that are listed in the only grant writing book you'll ever need. There's philanthropynewsdigest.org. Go to that website and click on RFPs, which stands for Request for Proposal. There's also the foundationscenter.org website, which has a lot of free information, but the database of U.S. foundations is not free. It's a subscription-based database. You can also go to Foundation Directory Online, Quick Start. Click the orange Get Started Now link and you can register for a free account. There's the Grant Space Knowledge Base, which has information and advice about foundations, corporations, government funders, individual donors. There's grants.gov. That's a centralized source of information about federal grants. There's federalregister.gov, which is a daily publication that reports on all different federal actions by the federal government. There's cdfa.org, which stands for Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance, and it provides information on funding available to different governments, nonprofit organizations, and individuals. There is tgic.com/funding sources, which gives you a list of funding opportunities state by state. So here are some results for South Carolina, these links here. So that covers what is a grant, how to think about whether or not you need one, and where do you find the different opportunities, and what kind of work should you do to figure out what you need to do to apply for a particular grant. If you have any questions, please hop into the discussion forum on Blackboard and share your questions or comments there.